This is a foundation that literally is a result of translational medicine. Mr. Kauffman began grinding oyster shells in his basement back in the late 50s, which is on the market today as Oscal. Created the Osteoporosis Foundation, had the first $2 billion drugs in the marketplace, diltiazem and cardizem. Many, many years ago, I worked there. And my career took me through the pharmaceutical industry to Europe to Aventis, working with drug project teams to try to figure out how in the world do we move things. In the pharmaceutical world, they have this issue too. How do you get stuff out of the pipeline from research into the commercial marketplace? I joined the foundation 5 years ago, never thought in a million years I would work in a not-for-profit. But our CEO, and we're a $2 billion foundation predominantly focused on entrepreneurship, and the reason we care about entrepreneurship is that Mr. Kauffman cared about economic growth writ large. And our CEO was the first head, interestingly enough, since I'm here, of a healthcare policy institute at Johns Hopkins, was a Robert Wood Johnson Fellow. And he tricked me into working at the Kauffman Foundation by getting me interested in why it was back in 2003 we'd seen a surge in funding into the National Institute of Health, which then, of course, trickled out to all of you. And, in fact, the number of INDs for new chemical entities was going down, and not a little, but a lot. And said, geez, can't you just help us figure that out? So I've been there ever since. And what I'd like to talk to you about today, let's see if I'm pushing right buttons. Okay. What I'd like to talk to you about today is what our research has found. As I said, we fund economic research, working with the National Bureau of Economic Research, in trying to understand, the innovation process, the commercialization process, and ultimately, how do you get stuff to market? And I'd like to put a plug in for a new book, and it's not because I'm here, but because it's literally the best book I've read in a long time. Orna Berry, who used to be the chief scientist in Israel, is a good friend of mine. And this book was just published by the Council on Foreign Relations called Startup Nation. Literally the best book I've ever written. And it really helps portray what, this is for your dean and the leaders of your university, what needs to be in place in an ecosystem from a policy, culture, et cetera, perspective to encourage commercialization. And we get no money from this, so. So what I found when we started looking at this problem is that what we had created in our country, and as you all know, this is quite complicated and I'm trying to make it really easy. What we created in our country, in the United States, through our funding vehicles is 30 or 40 years ago, we had big R&D engines like Bell Labs, HP Labs, et cetera. Pharma was putting huge amounts of money into basic research. And what's happened over the last 20 to 30 years is research, and I won't say R&D, I will just say R. R has declined in every industry, not just big pharma and bio, but every industry, while at the same time, as I said, we've seen this surge in federal funding through NIH, NSF, and others. And what happened during that process is a couple of things. Back in 1980, as many of you know, The Economist calls it the goose that laid the golden egg. Bayh-Dole was passed, and Bayh-Dole was passed for a really good reason. And the reason was poor industry people, entrepreneurs, and VCs ended up trying to negotiate with the federal government intellectual property, and everyone realized that was a horrible idea. And so Bayh-Dole was meant to give rights to the university to manage their IP in whatever they viewed was a beneficial process. Now, I call this the unfunded mandate because that's like changing a policy lever overnight, and everyone is supposed to be smart about how to do this without any money, any resources, nothing. So what's ended up happening, and literally this is a descriptive picture of what it looks like in every single entity that receives federal funding. You have a whole bunch of labs that are receiving money. On the outside world, and this is, I believe 2 years ago, the data was that NIH was funding 800 institutions. So multiply this left side by 800. And on the right-hand side, you have people in the commercial marketplace supposedly ready to take your wonderful discoveries and get them to market. All of, different color sizes, et cetera, in terms of different kinds of technology companies, angels, entrepreneurs, big companies, little companies, consumer companies, et cetera. So you could imagine that what ended up happening, I'm sure in your case as well as everyone else, the university, in order to try to hold up the ideas of Bayh-Dole, created something. Created an office that, whatever it's called, a licensing office, a technology transfer office, et cetera. And ultimately what we ended up doing is creating a funnel by which, and as many faculty members have said to me, we have choices on where we get to publish. Why do we not have choices on how we get to commercialize? But what we found in our research is a couple of things that are reality every day and have been a reality for a long time. Is, first of all, we have faculty that work directly with the commercial marketplace and don't necessarily link through that licensing office. In the same way, for many years, Steve Lazarus is a friend at Arch Venture Partners and said, 20 years ago, all we did was follow federal dollars, who was NIH funding, and we'd go out and meet them and keep track of them, et cetera, and license their technology. So while the idea is a great one in terms of the university ownership of licensing, and licensing accountability, there's significant flaws in the entire process. And so let me talk about that. So the first flaws are, are people in this room who are receiving federal funding have any education and knowledge about how do I identify if I have something interesting in my lab? How do I know what the regulatory pathway is? How do I know who my commercial partner is? And the answer, of course, is no, which is why you're here. So we know that we're providing significant amount of federal dollars, whatever agency it's from, into our universities or federal labs, but there's literally no educational component that goes with that. And there's a whole bunch of issues beside that. One is the pursuit of trying to move innovations forward that literally have no commercial marketplace. And you see this all the time. Faculty love their ideas, I understand, usually have a significant value on what they think their ideas are worth, but don't necessarily understand the realities of the commercial marketplace. We also know a really big problem happens. And that is literally your lack of access of resources to help you evaluate that innovation. I was having a conversation when I came in this morning. I immediately sought out a couple of the young women that I saw in the coffee area and asked them what they were doing here. And the reason that I was so interested in speaking with them specifically is that this access and this linkage between scientists and people in whatever, if it's a big company, it's a venture capital company, if it's a entrepreneur, it is literally the linkage and the relationships between these people that we have found is so critical. And just to give you an example, I think it was in 2004, we conducted just a simple phone survey of the top 50 patenters in this country, Bob Langer and friends. And ask them, what's the deal with you? And how is it that you are such a prolific inventor, and not just an inventor, somebody that has an invention that actually makes a difference in the marketplace? And all of them, 49 of them, said the exact same thing. And that was, it was because of either consulting with industry or working on an industry-sponsored research project when they were in their late 20s or early 30s. And it was but for that experience that they understood, and they all described it as like this aha moment, that they understood the impact and the relevance of the research that they were working on in the commercial marketplace. I think Dennis Leota said to me, and Dennis has started 7 companies, and Dennis is still at Emory, and as he said, he was at Emory all along, even when no one knew what Emory was. And as he said, he literally was a nerd, working in his lab, and had absolutely no idea why in the world anyone in the commercial marketplace would care about anything that was going on in his lab. And if it wouldn't have been for that opportunity to have linkages. And now you ask, so why in the world was I talking to these young women about this? Well, the answer is women do not commercialize technologies at any rate that men do. And we found this 3 or 4 years ago. We funded a couple of studies in parallel to try to figure out the outcome. And frankly, we only care for one reason. We only care because at this point, in the United States, we have more women. I'm not sure about MDs, but it probably is true as well. We have more women as of 3 years ago getting PhDs in all areas of life science than we have men. So as I said, we care about economic outcomes. Now I have an economic problem. And what we found, Fiona Murray at MIT did a survey of women faculty at a number of the top institutions in our country. And what she found was amazing. And these are tenured faculty. What she found is, and this was, I believe, 3.5 years ago, she found that almost all of them were sitting on wildly impressive boards. And the boards were NASA, they were NIH, they were NSF, and other wonderful not-for-profit organizations. A very, very small percentage sat on scientific advisory boards of a startup, industry advisory boards, or scientific advisory boards, or industry boards of directors. And obviously at the same universities, a significant number of the men faculty did or had sat on industry. So again, I go back to my point. How do I understand? You need at some point in your career to understand the relevance of what you're working on in your lab in the commercial marketplace, and building those relationships or not seems to be one of the most critical barriers that we have in place, or potential enablers. So lack of linkage to experienced entrepreneurial faculty within your own university, and in many cases, their networks in the commercial marketplace. So what have we found that seems to be working? What we have found is that a significant number of universities have linked. Stanford has this Cool Spark program that they have linked a number of the kids from their MBA school to do market research for a lot of the people in the medical school. So go out and figure out what in the world is this technology and what does it mean in the commercial marketplace before I waste too much time. And to give you another specific example there, Vera Kalmeyer is a friend of mine. She's an MD PhD who runs Equity for Health and has been teaching a venturing course every semester at Stanford for, I don't know, the last 9 or 10 years. And Vera said to me that the first day when she shows up at this class, she will say to all of the students in the class that are in med school, I don't ever want you to write a business plan in your entire life. What I want you to know is how to recognize an opportunity if it falls in your lap, and how to do brief analysis of what could the potential be for that opportunity, and understand what I mean when I even say, what is the regulatory pathway? And she said, other than that, I don't want you to do anything other than to go find some entrepreneurs or people in the commercial marketplace, because that's not what you're being trained to do. So we know that the enabler of having experienced entrepreneurial faculty that are at your universities that can either teach or work with your medical students is really significant. We also know that and we've done some analysis on disclosure rates at universities, and there's this wonderful man, and his name is not coming to me right now, who took over as the dean of the medical center down at University of New Mexico. And he said to me that their disclosure rate, that faculty just really didn't think it was important to move through the commercialization process. And he said, so it was obvious time that I had to change the language. And I said, what do you mean by that? And he said, I had to stop using the C word. And what I had to start doing was talking about your role as a scientist and what you're trying to do in healthcare, and how important that is that we get whatever it is, your new knowledge, into the hands of the commercial marketplace, both through publications as well as, if there is a technology sitting there, into the hands of the patient. So it's all about the patient. And what he found through this process, and we kept track of him for about 3 or 4 years, is his disclosure rate of new innovations skyrocketed. And it was all about really changing culture and helping people, again, focus on why. I mean, you all, of anyone within a university, are here for a purpose, and you're here to help patients. And so how obvious it is that getting your technology to market is important. And last, and this is both an enabler and a barrier, is we find significant crazy policies in place that keep essentially, whether it's grad students or faculty, from even being interested in the process. And when I use the word policy, I'll use it in the broadest possible context. And I'll use it going back to my last slide. Many times what we find is that there are 2 or 3 or 4 people working in a licensing office. So if I have a significant large university and they're focused on a bunch of different kinds of technologies, literally I've created a barrier right there. I'm expecting a couple of people who probably aren't making $1 million a year, like their counterparts in the venture capital industry, to understand my innovation, whether it's anthropology to zoology. And it's insane. I mean, it's absolutely an insane thought process. But we see a multitude of other barriers that are in place. In many cases, again, they're cultural. And I'm trying to think of analogies. All of them people have told me I shouldn't repeat. So as an example, discouraging faculty that do not have tenure from ever talking to anybody about anything that's commercializable. Because, in fact, that could be a negative sign. Discouraging faculty from taking a sabbatical. I mean, what we have found in our research is that very few faculty ever leave the university, and frankly, I don't think we want them to. It's wonderful to be a founder. Your skills aren't necessarily the same skills to be a CEO. And so the ultimate best thing that could have happen is that translation happens through medical graduate students and people coming out of the university that have worked with you in your lab, but that you stay put. But again, we need policies in place to allow and support that from happening. I will tell you, the Kauffman Foundation started this last year because we're really, really worried, obviously, about the economy and economic recovery, but we're also worried that however often I can go out and make these speeches, it's not enough. And we know that we have a significant amount of innovation laying around on the shelf of universities, and how can we get it out? And for the first time in our history, we have 47,000 postdocs in this country. 47,000. That's what I call well-educated, probably underutilized, definitely underpaid, as many of you know in this room. So we created the Kauffman Postdoc Fellows Program. And we reached out to our world of rockstar scientists and asked them to be advisors. Dan, I think you know Tony Atala, who works with us, and a number of others from across the country. And they helped us select them. And we selected them based upon 2 things. One, are they working on an innovation that we believe we can help within 12 months move them farther along? And 2, do we actually believe that they are interested in being a founder? And not just interested, but have obviously showed substantial experience in doing so. We brought all of these people together for the first time. There ended up being 15 of them. We have a significant interest from Washington in replicating this program. And guess what we found? We found IP issues like I've never seen before. Absolute mess. With literally, I would say 90% of these kids. I don't care if they're from Harvard, if they're from Stanford, where, MIT. And we found significant internal cultural issues. We literally had one of our fellows who was running a lab at a very significant university. And essentially, because we have 47,000 postdocs, a lot of these people are very cheap labor doing God's work in our labs. And when her faculty advisor, who is really supposed to be running the lab, found out that she was going to do this and was literally going to spend her time commercializing technology, he asked her to leave the lab, and we had to have Bob Langer adopt her over at MIT. So that's just an example of the cultural issue around here. So our next question was, okay, so if we look at the very first piece of how do I even know if I have innovations, what are some of those policies that need to be in place? The next question is, how do I get to proof of concept, and can I get to proof of concept within the university? And I'm going to jump forward, I think, two slides, and then I'm going to go back. So what we found is that I've spent the last 4 or 5 years working with a couple of universities that have been trying to do this. You could call it a proof of concept center, you could call it a translational research center, whatever you want to call it. And when I went to Charlie Cooney about 3 years ago, who's the lead faculty advisor for Despondé Center, and life science people always poo-poo me when I talk about Charlie because they say, oh, really, he's a chemical engineer? And I say, oh, really? And he's a founding board member of Genentech and Genzyme. And Charlie and Desh Despondé had created the Despondé Center. And Desh said to me, I'm not an alumni of MIT. I'm a serial entrepreneur, and I did this because I wanted to prove that you really could move technologies further along in the university. And ask us to do an evaluation of both the Despondé Center and the von Liebig Center after they had had 5 years of experience, which we did and was published last year. Since then, we've been working with Reg Kelly, who runs what's called QB3, which is also the same kind of a model. But for the first time, it's a collaboration between UCSF and Berkeley. When others ask me if a collaboration will work, I say no. The only reason that Reg can do it is because he's the former provost of the UC system. And so it works, otherwise it wouldn't work. But what we have found in these centers, and the Kauffman Foundation put half of a bucket of money in to create our own. At the University of Kansas, and it literally took me 4 years to do this, and I did it for only one reason. One was the stars were aligned appropriately, and I had access to some significant people from industry who were interested in going into academia and doing this, and because it was in my own backyard, and I could prove that you could do this in a non-large university. And I'm not going to spend any time talking about it, but I will tell you, we are 9 months in, and it's beyond anything I ever imagined could happen in terms of they have become the drug development partner for Leukemia and Lymphoma Foundation. They have significant relationships with Lilly, with 3 or 4 other foundations, with a couple of companies in Europe. So I know that it can work. But what we found in this center, and after we published this report, I think I've received 20 calls from universities telling me they have one of these too. And they don't. Because what they have is they all have wonderful gap funds. And frankly, money doesn't mean anything. It means something, and you need it here, but you need it in very small tranches, and it is the least significant part of this model. The most significant part of this model is, A, you put together an advisory board member that looks like the who's who of whatever industry you're focusing on. At the University of Kansas, we have a former faculty member from years ago who ran the largest pharmaceutical company in India, lives in London, and flies in for our advisory board meetings. We have Chris Austin from and all the rest are rock star scientist founders of companies in the life science space. They actually works the exact same way at UCSF as it does at UCSD, and it does at Despondé Center. That outside board are the decision makers on what innovations, you move forward. And what's fascinating with this is when all of these programs started and they put out an RFP within their university, the kind of innovations they received and the amount were sad. I sat on the first board when we did it at the University of Kansas, but I understand the same thing happened at MIT and von Liebig and at UCSF. And again, it was about creating a culture. It was about faculty really understanding this isn't just about I'm trying to get one other grant from somebody else. It's about identifying technologies that are actually have potential to move forward. And guess what? If we can do it within the safety of a not-for-profit institute, we can get to interesting go, no-go decisions, and we can, for the benefit of the university, add value to it while it's still sitting there. But what's critical here, and in all places they have put these in place, and this sounds, I realize, crazy to a university, is if you don't have industry expertise sitting as part of one of these institutes, people who've literally worked in industry for a long time, running projects, you can't do this. I mean, that is an absolute requirement. We also, with each one of these programs, they have created very focused educational programs for the faculty and the graduate students. So we've had this great benefit of not only do you have this commercialization center that's adding value, but the spillover value is we have a whole new flock of faculty and graduate students that have participated, kind of like workshops like this, which is the intention of the CTSA and others. We also find with each one of these that it's very small level of funding. What we know for sure in our research about entrepreneurship is if you give them too much money, they will kill it. They will screw it up. So what's really, really important is that these are very small amounts of money. I think Reg Kelly's doing about $150K, but the others all give between 50 and 75 in tranches, and that could be a 6-month tranche. But you got to prove that you get to your next milestone before you go any further. Tony Atala said, I'm helping him start a regenerative medicine foundation. And he said he's going to put a big sign at Wake Forest, and the sign is going to say it starts with the grant. Because there is clearly a culture in many cases that it ends with the grant. and it is accelerating the cycle that is important. And ultimately, the real trick, frankly, that the two that first started this didn't figure out until too late is how to build a sustainable model. In all 4 of these centers, it cost $20 million over 4 years to get this thing going. I'm confident that in the one we're funding, the Institute of Advancing Medical Innovation, and Reg is at UCSF, because we began with sustainability in mind, that we've put some things in place that will help. The other piece that is unbelievably critical about this model is that they have to come with mentors. And so you see on my slide, I have the MIT Venture Mentoring Service, and you mentioned that I would for sure talk about mentoring. So again, back to my comments about scientists working with people in the commercial marketplace. If through these centers we have technologies that are moving along, I mean, clearly we're moving them along because we're going to eventually move them out. And so it's important at this point that we're using outside mentors who are going to start pulling versus us pushing. Alec Dingy, a 7-time entrepreneur, went to Bob Brown at MIT 6 years ago and said, I'll give you $1 million if you'll give me your boardroom and parking passes. And I think Bob thought that was odd. But and Alex said it took a year for them to take his money because they couldn't figure it out. But today, the MIT Venture Mentoring Program has 124 mentors mentoring over 100 and I will loosely call them companies. Early stage things. In some cases, they're companies. In some cases, they're technologies. And we've been working with them for the past 3 years to replicate this model. We've started one at Yale. We've started one in St. Louis that's not even attached to the university. It's sitting outside the university, so it could work with multiple technologies. We've started one in Toronto. And shockingly enough, I think we're going to start one in Detroit. So that's kind of a high-level summary. Let me go backwards. So in terms of barriers, so it isn't just lack of access of proof of concept money. Everybody tells me there's no early stage money, but the more important part is this experienced resources. While lack of understanding of funding vehicles is clearly a problem as well. As he mentioned, we have been for the past 3 years working with CEOs. I've been collecting all the CEOs of disease philanthropies, mostly in the space of people really doing things to try to advance the technologies. So Bob Beal at Cystic Fibrosis, Debbie Brooks, the co-founder of Michael J. Fox, and Kathy Gusti at multiple myeloma and others. And many of these foundations are getting into the business of what I would call early stage funding. Frank Douglas, my former boss and the former global head of R&D of Aventis, and I wrote a paper about this last year, de-risking, for the then head of the NIH, that's available on our website, that shows very specific examples of philanthropies who are working in partnership with both universities and with startup companies, because in many cases that's the only vehicle that's going to make this happen. And I think there's a lack of awareness that philanthropies are literally kind of in this early stage venture philanthropy business. As I mentioned, my friends that are located in my own city are literally the drug development partner for leukemia and lymphoma. What we also again find as barriers is show me a university that has a significant number of industry-sponsored research or bio-sponsored research, and we show you more commercialization. Again, back to the same point. So I think it's a metric that's important and clearly never understood or talked about when anybody's talking about outcomes of university research. We talked about university policies as barriers. Time to plan for this step is when you're working on the patent. Okay. Yeah. As I said, just within our own postdoc program, and we are kind of a home for faculty members that are struggling with commercialization. A friend of mine, Renee Coswan, is the founder of Restasis, and I was so happy to find out that she created her own foundation that's called IP Advocacy. For any of you interested, it is a foundation focused on helping university faculty, so that we don't have to do this. And she made a lot of money, and she's very serious about helping. But what we find, just like within our graduate student or our postdocs that we're working with, unfortunately, in many cases, the IP gets crippled before it even gets out the door. So working with groups of advisors before you do anything is really an important thing to do. Another element, and tell me if I'm running out of time here, another element to enabling these collaborations, and so this is like in this proof of concept stage, I'm still within the university, we created a couple of things. As he mentioned, we started something at the National Academy called the University Industry Demonstration Partnership. And the reason that we did this is because all of my friends in industry would tell me how horrible and greedy universities were, and universities would tell me how horrible and greedy industry was. And I thought, these people just aren't talking to each other. And it's not important for the licensing people to talk to each other. It's for the VPs of research and the provost to talk to executives within the industry and to start developing. I sat in a meeting about 3 or 4 years ago with Rich Newton, who was then the dean of engineering at Berkeley and a rock star scientist, while he and the people from HP, and so it's not vertically focused problem, it's in every problem. He and the people from HP screamed at each other because they had completely different definitions of what is sponsored research. And they've been doing it for years. And so it helps you understand what some of those issues are. We have, I believe today, about 85 universities that are part of our National Academy program and about 60 heads of R&D from industry. We also created something called Science Commons. We were the seed funder of Science Commons. And the reason that we did this, anybody in this room familiar with Science Commons? Oh, I'm depressed. Okay. So one of our lessons in working with Bob Cook-Deegan, who's the head of the Duke Center for Genomics and Law, and a number of our other friends in the legal research field, is what we found. Bob did a study, and he's a very well-known scientist as well as lawyer. Bob did a study of all of the IP that came out of the human genome, and he followed it. And essentially what he found was, I don't remember the number of patents that came out, but we created 274 companies, of which 17 are alive today. And the amount of venture capital is staggering. And essentially a huge lesson in there is that we were patenting things that we didn't need to be patenting. And my colleague Frank Douglas describes it as, we didn't know what we didn't know about science. And we didn't understand what was pre-competitive and what was not. And so we created Science Commons literally to start talking about that pre-competitive space and to start building collaborative, what I would call pre-IP models, which is another reason why I work with a lot of CEOs of disease philanthropies. Kathy Gusti called me 2 years ago and told me she'd been working with general counsels at 4 significant universities for 2 years to try to build a tumor bank. And she said, I'm going to die before we build this tumor bank. And she's serious. She really has multiple myeloma. And she was crying on the phone. And she said, the problem is that the lawyers don't understand what's pre-competitive and what's not pre-competitive. And so we're all spending time talking about IP that we don't even really have IP on. So Science Commons was literally seed funded by us, by HiQ Foundation here in New York, and a number of other organizations to try to build an understanding about this pre-competitive space. The Translational Medicine Partnership, which somebody then made me change to Alliance, and I never changed this slide, is a conference that we hold every year. We try to bring together all of our CEOs of disease philanthropies, heads of R&D from pharma bio, and rockstar scientists that are working in that collaborative space to literally the discussion at the Philadelphia meeting we held this year is what's going to happen after pharmaceutical industry falls apart. How are we going to put it back together again? And the iBridge Network is of which your university is not a partner. We have 99 other universities that are partnering with us on the iBridge Network. And the iBridge Network, similar to Science Commons, was created as a place where universities can post their innovations, so to speak. Does anybody in this room know Clay Shirky at NYU? So Clay Shirky is probably one of the best known people in the IT innovation space, open collaborative models. Clay wrote the New York Times bestseller, Here Comes Everybody, How to Organize Without Organizations. And he found me because of the iBridge Network and said, this is what you call Craigslist for innovation. So I would just encourage you to look. We will go global next week with our first external outside the United States universities. And so last but not least, I'd like to close with an understanding that this is the world that we live in. And our ecosystem is literally comprised of, as you all know, because you're living in one, significant, it might not feel like you're highly funded, but you are, significant research-funded universities who need to be collaborating with all 3 other actors in this ecosystem, startups, large-scale firms, and governments. And what I have found is when I find porous boundaries between the university and these other actors, we find real translational research happening. When I find big walls, we don't. And as some of you that were, I've had this fight, and I'm so happy Francis Collins is there and others, because we've been having a fight with Dr. Zerhouni for the last 3 years, that while the CTSA idea was a great idea, it in some cases is an exercise in great grant writing that doesn't literally make a difference at the university. And that was evidenced when I presented to the CTSA T1 group, and one of the very first questions that was asked to me when I was finished is, what is intellectual property? And I want you to be stunned by that. because clearly we're not doing what we're supposed to be doing with these grants if we're not building an understanding with our faculty of what does that even mean, translational research. And that's your job, not mine. But I would like to leave with you the idea that it is all about porous boundaries and figuring out how you can collaborate with many, many different organizations. And I would encourage you to support junior faculty and postdocs in their involvement in commercialization workshops. Send them to me. We don't mind. They can come and live with us. And as I said, please look at how you are an agent of change within your university. Look at how you are innovating and running your own entity, and if you are being entrepreneurial, and how you are changing the ecosystem in which you live. So thank you for inviting me.